Hello, and welcome to the Orthodontic Products Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Werner. On today's episode, I'm joined by Gary Solomon, CEO and co founder of Black Talon Security, to talk about cybersecurity in the dental space. Cyber attacks like ransomware attacks are more common than ever. Not only are large hospital systems getting hit, but so are small private dental practices. So I wanted to talk to Gary to get some perspective on where the threat level is today, and more importantly, what you can do in your practice to protect your business and your patients' data if you're not already doing so. Gary, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Allison.
So, to get started, can you give our audience kind of the current threat assessment for the dental space, especially for private practices?
Yeah, look, I think you nailed it. I think a lot of practitioners say, this is only happening to the hospitals, the large DSOs. But the more and more you talk to people, you realize, they have friends, colleagues, practice right down the street that have been hit. And it is a systemic issue. And one of the things that I tell all doctors is the hackers don't care what size organization you are.
Mm.
In fact, they often know that these smaller healthcare entities like dental practices, small medical groups, plastic surgeons, you name it,
Mm-hmm.
they're kind of easy pickings, right? Because they're not going to have the same types of defensive technologies as a larger medical group or a large healthcare system. So unfortunately, we do see hundreds of dental practices of all sizes and specialties being hit in a multitude of ways: ransomware, email intrusions, various forms of extortion. And I think typically what happens is they get hit in one of two ways. They either are the victim of social engineering, where Mary at the front desk clicks on a link that she thinks is from the referral down the street, or hackers exploit vulnerabilities on the computers, like the servers, the workstations, the firewalls, and literally hack their way in.
Okay.
So this is a real problem. In terms of the extent, the big problem right now is the ransom demands, right? The days of a $5,000 or $10,000 ransom demand is way gone, right? We haven't seen that in years.
Okay.
I will tell you, for most dental practices, orthodontic practices, the ransom demands are typically six figures and up.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's no joke.
Okay.
We just did one for an orthodontic group a couple months ago, and their ransom demand was $750,000 for a 2-location orthodontic group.
Wow. Okay. So, what does that look like for a practice that gets hit? What are they seeing that tells them they're a victim?
Yeah, so typically there's one or two tells that they're going to see. One, it's very obvious. There's a ransom note on the screen. It's got a skull and crossbones, like, we've hit you with ransomware, pay us or else.
Okay.
And then sometimes it's not so obvious. There may be like a little text file on a desktop. And typically the first indication is their software doesn't work, or they can't access the cloud, or imaging doesn't load. And then the IT company will log in and be like, oh, it looks like you got hit with ransomware. We're seeing encrypted or locked files all across your environment. And then that's, usually a clear indication that it's, game over per se, and game on for the hackers.
Okay. And is that being caused by someone opening an email and clicking on a link, or going to a site and clicking on a link? Is that how that's typically happening?
So the data that we have, and a lot of companies that do incident response, which are like breach companies like ours that specialize in these investigations, as well as the law firms and the insurance carriers, they'll tell you between 60 and 70% of all ransomware cases are employee initiated, right? To your point, they're Google searching something and they click on a malicious download for an update to QuickBooks, for instance.
Okay.
Or they get an email that is coming from maybe someone they know, someone they trust, an accountant, an attorney, referring practice, someone like that. And Mary at the front desk clicks on that link, it downloads a malicious payload, and 2 weeks later they have a ransomware event. So that's let's just say 65% will split the difference.
Okay.
The other 30-ish% is through what's called vulnerability exploitation. And what a vulnerability is, very simply, it's a defect in a piece of software or hardware that hackers have created, and hackers have created a hacking tool that exploits that vulnerability. So for instance, a vulnerability on a firewall, right? Your firewall has software on it. The software was coded by a human. Humans make coding mistakes. So hackers find these coding mistakes, and then they build a tool, and they run this tool against the firewall, and the firewall's like, come on in, I don't need a username and password. And next thing you know, 5 minutes later, the hackers are on your server. And it sounds so simplistic, but unfortunately, this is actually what's happening. The same thing can happen with computers. You can have a vulnerability in Adobe, in Chrome, in Microsoft Word, in
Okay.
Windows 11 or server operating system.
Yeah.
And hackers will get on those devices, exploit those vulnerabilities, and gain access to the environment. Or you visit a website, say through Google Chrome, and
Hmm.
that website has been infected with a piece of malicious code that looks for the defect in Google Chrome. And when
Okay.
you visit that website, that server attacks your computer and you're hit. And
Okay.
it goes right through your firewall. A lot of people are like, "Oh, I have a firewall; it'll
Hmm.
stop it." And then I just say, we have to think logically here,
Hmm.
because if firewall stopped all these attacks, we wouldn't even be having these conversations.
Right.
And
Right.
I think a lot of doctors have this really significant false sense of security that, hey, I have a firewall. My IT company just sold me this latest generation of them. I just spent seven hundred
Yeah.
dollars on it. I
Hmm.
have antivirus software, so I'm good. The reality is everyone has that, and the hackers still get through.
Okay. So once the hacker has gotten through, then what are they looking at? What is that communication? And if they pay the ransom, do they get their
Mhm.
data back, or is there a way around that? What happens?
Yeah, so great questions. So typically, the way it works is when a hacker gets into your network, they will persist on the network for typically 2 to 4 weeks, which means they sit there, they observe everything you're doing in your practice, they're watching the screens, they're watching everything all of your employees are doing,
Okay.
and during that time frame, they are siphoning off all of your data. And antivirus
Oh.
software is not designed to detect these types of things. Right. So if
Oh.
a hacker deploys like a screen sharing application, like
Okay.
a lot of people know things like Splashtop
Hmm.
or Log Me In or Go to My
Hmm.
PC, antivirus software is typically not going to stop that. And when these hackers move around the network, they'll gather all of your data, and
Hmm.
then at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'll just download your practice management software, your imaging software, your
Okay.
HR files, your QuickBooks.
Right.
And once they've taken all the data and they verify that they have your data, then they launch the ransomware attack, right?
Okay.
Because they know once they press that button to launch the attack, it's game over because you're going to walk in and know you've been attacked.
Mm.
But they leverage that time, that 2 week time, to go undetected to do a lot of damage. Some of the other
Wow.
things they'll do is they will look for your backups. So I hear a lot of doctors like, "Oh, we have all these backups."
Yeah.
We've done incident response cases where the hackers have found their way into the backups and
Oh
also
God.
destroyed the backups. They want to win. They want to get paid. They want their
Wow.
$750,000. So
Yeah.
you have that. You also have email intrusions. So
Uh-huh.
we now see plenty of cases where they get into the doctor's email. And I want you to kind of think of this logically.
Hmm.
Think about when you log into your email, say Gmail, whatever it might be. After you enter your username and password on your computer, let's say you do that today. In a week from now, does your email system typically ask you to re-enter your username and password?
Right.
Often
No.
it doesn't. It drops a token on your computer, says, "Oh, I trust Allison's computer. We don't need to ask Allison for her password again."
Hmm.
Amazon is another great example. We all know that. Log into Amazon today, and in 30 days, you don't need to put your password in again. It's
Right.
trusted your computer. So when the hackers get these screen sharing apps on your computers, they'll just go to your browser, type in gmail.com, or they'll look at your browsing history to see what email you use, and your email just opens.
Oh.
So now they have full access to your email. Then what they start doing is they'll, email that oral surgeon down the street, that accountant, that supplier, and they'll socially engineer them and get them to give up something or click on a link. And now you have another victim because of your attack. But it makes sense, right?
God.
In a sick kind of way.
Uh-huh.
But from a criminal's mindset, like, it's the perfect thing. I'm going to assume the role of Allison. Everyone trusts Allison. So
Right.
when Alice's friends and colleagues open an email from her, they're going to click on the link from her. And that's what happens here. And then you have bank intrusions. They're gaining access to people's bank accounts because now think about this, right? I'm not trying to make everyone sick here. but,
Even
but
I'm
here's the
getting nervous.
if I'm in Allison's email, right?
Uh-huh.
And I go to the bank and I say, I forgot my password. Where does the banking software typically send you your
To the
password?
email.
And then you just log in.
Right.
And then they execute wire transfers. So we've seen the full scope of this. And the same thing applies for cloud practice management,
Okay.
especially in the ortho space with a heavy adoption of cloud.
Yeah.
What do a lot of doctors and staff do with their usernames and passwords in their browser?
They just save it and have it
Exactly.
default open. Yeah.
Yep. So you open abccloudsoftware.com and Google Chrome's like, boop, pops your username and
Right.
password right into the browser and they log into your software. So, a lot of practices are like, oh my God, I never thought of that happening. But it's the most simplistic thing. And we've seen it over and over again.
Oh man.
We'll call, right, on behalf of the practice that's been a victim, we'll call the cloud provider, the
Hmm.
EMR, the practice manager, like, no, 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 it's fine. We haven't had any intrusions. And then we're like, look at the log files. And then they're like, all right, someone logged in Saturday morning at 2 a.m., right? And the doctor's like, yeah, that's nice. But it came from Mary's computer. So
Right.
what I always tell doctors is you have to think differently. It's not so, straightforward anymore. It's not like, well, I'm never going to give up my username and password
Right.
and I have a firewall and I have antivirus, or I'm done with all this and I move, all my data to the cloud and that's that company's problem.
Right.
It's not though, so you asked another interesting question, which is assuming we have to pay the ransom, right?
Yeah.
And what most doctors have to understand is that over 90% of all intrusions into these dental practices result in the theft of their data, whether it's cloud or their own server, right? It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the truth. And what happens is the threat actors will say, you have to pay us because we stole your data. And the doctor's like, I don't really think they stole the data. I talked to my IT company. They don't see any movement in the firewall. And then I'll say, listen, if I watch a 2-hour YouTube video, it's going to use more data than me stealing your practice management software. That's the reality of it. You can't just look at your firewall and say they didn't get my data. But, a lot of people want to convince the doctors, right, as an IT company, like, we protected you, you're fine. Then what happens is the threat actors be like, oh, you don't believe me that I stole your data? You know what? I'm going to publish 10% of your records and I'll put photographs of your children, your health history forms, panoramic CEFs, photographs, all up on the dark web. Here's a link. Go look for yourself if you don't believe me. And we'll navigate to that website with the doctors. And they're like, oh my God, those are my patients. And it's viewable by anyone that knows how to access these sites, these auction sites. So typically what happens from that point forward is the law firm that is working with the victim will recommend to the doctor in many cases, listen, we got a problem here. Even if you have a viable backup, or even if your system is still functioning in the cloud, if we don't get this data removed, you're going to have class action lawsuits. You're going to have all these people saying, wait, you had the option of paying the ransom, right? You had the option of paying the ransom. You didn't do it. And now my children's identities are stolen because you didn't make that decision. And it's a really tough position to be in. Like, no one wants to pay these criminals, right? I have 20 years of law enforcement experience. You think I want to, empower these criminals? No.
Yeah.
But sometimes for the business, for the practice, it's the only option. And I will tell you that most of the time, I've only ever seen it once in my career.
Hmm.
When you pay, the hackers do what they say, right? There's
Right.
this quote unquote honor amongst these.
Right. Yeah.
You
I've heard
pay
that.
to get the decryptor to unlock your files, they'll give it to you. If you
Mhm.
pay for them to destroy the data and not publish it on the dark web, they will destroy it. And they know that if they don't do that, then they get like a 1-star Google review per se, and no one's going to pay them. It's
Right.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
The world is just ridiculous. Like,
Yeah.
I tell people all the time, they look at me like I have 5 eyes. But so it most law firms in that operate in the healthcare space, the data
Mhm.
privacy space, they will advise the client, like, you probably don't have an option except to pay.
Wow.
So,
Okay. All right. So then, because I've heard a lot about how the cloud is safer, what does a practice do to protect themselves in this situation? Because it seems like there's so many vulnerabilities.
right.
So what are best practices at this
So
point?
you said something that's interesting. You assume the cloud is safer. And I think that is a good assumption.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with the cloud, and what a lot of people don't realize, is the cloud is a data center
Mm-hmm.
that has servers that you just connect to these servers, right?
Mhm.
So the assumption is that company that you have put your trust in is doing the correct thing to secure those servers.
Mm-hmm.
But look what happened to Change Healthcare. That's
Right.
100%.
Yes.
I'm like, there's a good example.
Yeah.
And a lot of other, I've seen quite a few dental cloud systems breached. I'm a huge proponent of the cloud. I think it's great
Mhm.
technology. I'm not against it. But
Yeah.
I think doctors who just say, I'm in the cloud, I'm good, that's a mistake.
Okay.
So a couple things to think about to answer your question. One, you have to address the risk within your own practices. And I think what happens in the dental space, and I come from a long line of family members who have been in the dental space,
Mhm.
dentists and doctors by nature are very trusting.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens is they listen to a podcast like this and they run back to their IT company and they're like, oh my God, I can't get ransomware. And the IT company like, you're fine, don't worry about it. and they go back to treating their patients. You can't run a practice like that,
Okay.
right? It's just like, I think the best analogy is if the doctor went to their practice administrator and be like, hey, how are we doing in 2024 over 2023? And the practice administrator is like, oh, we're better. Would the
Right.
doctor say, what does that mean? Are we
Yeah.
up like 5%? Are we up 20%?
Mhm.
Like, where are we?
Yeah.
But when it comes to security, because it's more of like it's a more complex animal, most doctors, when they hear you're okay from a security perspective, that's good enough. They're hearing what they want to hear.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I say is you no longer can do security through feelings. You have to do it through data.
Okay.
And one of the most important things, and this is a systemic change in the medical space, in the financial sector, and for most businesses,
Mhm.
most organizations outside of dental have shifted to dedicated firms. So they have their IT resources doing IT, and then you have cybersecurity companies doing cybersecurity because they specialize in this, just
Okay.
like an
Yeah.
orthodontist is a specialist, same concept, right? Um, because what we've found is that most IT companies focus 90% of their time on making sure the computers work. That's what
Mhm.
they focus on. And
Yeah.
they don't typically have the individuals inside of those organizations that specialize in security. So what they do is they just throw tools. They're like, oh, we
Okay.
bought this tool, we bought this tool.
Right.
The tools aren't configured properly, they're not managed properly.
Mhm.
They set the wrong expectations with the doctor in terms of what they're capable of doing.
Okay.
To kind of validate what I'm saying here is I lecture with a lot of the largest law firms in the country that specialize in healthcare.
Mhm.
And they're all saying the same thing. Guys, stop.
Mhm.
You have to separate security from IT because the IT company is not going to come to you and say, doctor, we suck at security.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Here are all the problems that we created with your network. Right.
Right.
You need a third party to say, hey, here are the problems with the network. Here's how to
Mhm.
fix them. Right.
Mhm.
And it's got to be monitored by a third party. It's the whole audit concept. You can't audit
Yeah.
yourself and stuff.
Okay.
So I think that's a systemic problem right now. That in the DSO space, the DSOs are starting to realize, whoa, we made a mistake here. Like we're starting to separate security and IT because they are
Ah.
two very different animals.
Okay.
It's like I always say in the dental space, if you needed orthognathic surgery, would the general dentist do the orthognathic surgery or the oral surgeon do it? And
Mhm.
anyone in this space will say, of course, the oral surgeon is going to do that.
Mhm. Right.
Or if you're a cardiologist, right, would you go to the cardiologist for open heart surgery or would you go to the cardiothoracic surgeon,
Mhm.
right? They're both heart doctors, but they do very different things. Same thing
Right.
in the tech space. So I think this is the first challenge that dentists have to overcome. And then in terms of actual defensive and offensive technologies that everyone should be utilizing,
Mhm.
I think it's very straightforward, right? There's a recipe for this now. First of all, security is not a single solution. And I
Okay.
see that a lot of times. The doctors are sold this new firewall and told, hey, you won't have a ransomware attack.
Mhm.
I'm not sure there's really many firewalls or, that's going to stop every ransomware attack. It doesn't
Yeah.
exist. It's not that I'm not sure. It doesn't even
Yeah.
exist, right? Because a multi-billion dollar company would buy it and we wouldn't hear about
Right.
multi-billion
Yeah.
companies being taken down.
Yeah.
So let's talk about defensive technologies, right? Defensive technologies are reacting when something bad's happening.
Okay.
So the typical defensive technology is your antivirus software. Something has landed on your computer. It's a piece of malicious code. Someone clicked on a link. Someone's doing something malicious on your computer trying to install something. And now you're relying on that antivirus software to hopefully detect it, which we know there's no 100% viable solution that finds everything. And then is it going to stop it in time, or the hacker is going to be able to execute their attack before the software can even react and fight back?
Okay.
So defensive technologies, so they have to be AI based. The two leaders in the industry right now that are really what I would call like top shelf or tier
Mhm.
one is CrowdStrike, which I think most people know because they had
Heard of
that
it.
issue and they brought down Delta Airlines
Oh, that's
and all these
right.
other
Okay.
companies.
Okay.
And then the other is a product called SentinelOne. SentinelOne is a
Okay.
product we use. These
Mhm.
guys are like Mercedes and BMW, like
Okay.
really, really strong products.
Mhm.
These products should be in your environment. The problem that I see with a lot of the managed service providers and IT companies is they don't configure them properly, or
Okay.
there's too much noise. They turn back the capabilities of the software, and the hackers then take advantage of it.
Exploit
Like,
that.
yeah, they dialed it back.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
made it. They turned off the capabilities of some of the features, and hackers got in.
Okay.
The other issue is for most ortho practices and dental practices, your IT company does not work 24/7. So the hackers almost always hit at night, after midnight, or most
Okay.
likely on the weekends. So
Okay.
these software applications may be alerting, hey, I'm under attack, and people are just not in the office,
Right.
or they're home in front of their computers, meaning the IT folks, and the network gets hit. So it needs to be what's called managed detection and response, where humans are going to respond 24/7.
Okay.
So SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, and managed by a company that watches it 24/7. Another good defensive technology is the firewall, right? You need to make sure your firewall is up to date with the latest generation. So talk to your IT company. Like any technology, these become obsolete after 4 or 5 years, and if you're not replacing
Okay.
that technology, you're just leaving holes in your
Okay.
environment. So that's a good technology. Email security is something that I'm really pushing lately.
Yeah.
This is software that sits in your email. It has to be corporate email. It can't be like at Gmail. It needs to be like
Okay.
at smileortho.com.
Yeah. Okay.
And what it does is it uses AI to read your emails, to look at the links, and it determines whether this email is malicious. So email security is really important. And what it'll do is if it determines that the email is malicious, it rips it out of the inbox so Mary can't click on something. It's not even there for her to act on. So
Okay.
then you have offensive technologies. And I will tell you, probably 95% of all dental practices, ortho, et cetera, do not have this technology. The first is vulnerability management.
Okay.
So there are some very powerful tools that cyber companies use that scan the computers and firewalls looking for vulnerabilities. And once it detects them, it can fix them automatically, right? So if it finds like, hey, Google Chrome is out of date on your computer, the software can detect the problem and say, oh, I have a patch for that, and actually fix the computer automatically. So that way Mary doesn't go to a website that's infected and she gets hit. You have to scan your computers every 4 hours for vulnerabilities. You have to scan your firewalls daily. What I see a lot of doctors like, oh, we had our IT company do a vulnerability scan. I'm like, okay, when did they do that? They're like, oh, they do that once a year. I'm like, just take that money, put it in the fireplace, and put a match to it, whatever you spent on that, because it's useless. It's out of date a day later.
Wow.
So
Okay.
vulnerability scans. But look, this was the standard 6 or 7 years ago, right? That businesses could have a scan done once a quarter. Typically once a year was even back then wasn't quite enough, but now it's daily. Like that's how quickly the threats have evolved.
Okay.
Vulnerability scans are really important. And another thing that you really need to do is what's called a penetration test. This is where an outside firm that employs ethical hackers will assume the role of a cyber criminal, actually try and break into your practice. And if they're successful, then a meeting would be held between the three parties, the IT company, the practice, and the cyber company, explaining, hey, here are the results of the pen test. Here's what we could have done from a data theft perspective or ransomware perspective, and here's how to fix it. You should be doing this twice per year. That's really becoming the quote unquote standard of care now. And especially on the firewalls, it's not very expensive anymore. So that's and look, from a regulatory and compliance perspective, if you're $1 million a year practice and you don't spend some money on security to do stuff like this, and you have an event, Office for Civil Rights may come to you and be like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, you generate all this money and you have all these patient records, and you didn't even use what's considered best practices to protect the data. It's not going to look good in their eyes, right? Because they're going to look at your revenue, right? And they're going to be like, oh, you're a $300,000 a year practice. I get it. This may be a little expensive. You're $1 million specialty practice, a $5 million specialty practice. You didn't do this. Like, shame on you. So, training, right? Training is important. So, as we said, around 30 to 40% of all attacks, sorry, I misspoke. Around 60 to 70% of all attacks are the result of people. So cybersecurity awareness training is very powerful. It educates you. It teaches your doctors and your staff on all the different types of scams that are out there. And that way your staff reads that email. They're like, whoa, this is definitely a scam. I learned about this. I'm not clicking on that link. Right. Or they're going to question it. They're going to call that practice. Hey, did you really send this to me? This looks weird. And they're going to be like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't sent you an email in 3 days. Right. Someone impersonating them or broke into their email. Training is required under federal law for ortho practices, dental practices. It has to be documented. It can't be like, oh, we sat and had pizza one day and I told my team not to click on things. Right. So there are training platforms that cybersecurity companies have, compliance companies have, that actually teach the doctors and staff about these scams, and it documents when they took the training, what they got on their quiz, and it does simulated phishing. So it actually send, the practice and their employees, simulated emails to see if they're clicking on things that they shouldn't. So that's another offensive technology that is highly effective, very cost effective also, and it's productive. It works really well.
So it seems like a practice almost needs to have like a schedule for the year and a checklist of the things they're going through to make sure they're doing this on a daily, on a monthly, on a quarterly, on a yearly level.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And onboarding, right? You hire a new employee. Hey,
Right.
before you use a computer, you're doing your sexual harassment training, right?
Mhm.
You're doing your patient engagement training. You're doing your cyber and HIPAA training. I mean, that's how most of our clients work.
Just a really like general question, because you mentioned there that like you, for a lot of this stuff, the software, the offensive, you need it attached to a corporate account,
Right.
email account. What if someone is going into their Gmail account or Yahoo account while in a browser while on their work computer? What
Mhm.
can
Yeah,
happen
great
there? Is there a
question.
vulnerability?
There is, right? So one of the things that our clients do is they have policies and procedures.
Hmm.
So for healthcare, you're really required under law to have a policy that says you cannot use a work computer for anything but work,
Okay.
right? Opening personal email, going banking, online
Hmm.
banking, shopping, Google searching, like that's all off limits. And
Okay.
the employees are technically supposed to sign that policy and acknowledge that they're not allowed to do that.
Hmm.
That's really important from a regulatory perspective, because if an employee does that and it causes a breach and you don't have a policy and procedure, when the government investigates you, it's going to be a huge problem, right?
Okay.
The flip side is, right, Mary signed that policy and procedure that she understood she wouldn't do that. She
Hmm.
does it and causes a breach. The government's going to say to doctor, look, you tried to do the right thing. You had the procedure in place. You
Hmm.
can't control ultimately what a person does.
Right.
We're probably not going to have a problem. We're not even going to have a discussion anymore.
Okay.
Dramatic difference, between those two types of events.
Hmm.
So, one of the things I've said for years, 7 years, like, look, the government for the most part is not fining dental practices for
Hmm.
breaches.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, we saw a Perio group with just a couple doctors get fined $250,000 because they didn't have this HIPAA risk assessment and policies and procedures in
Oh.
place. And the government went back 6 years prior to the event, and like, you can't produce a single document for 6 years. Boom.
Oh.
But the lawyers negotiated it down. It started
Hmm.
at a range from the 250 to 750,000, and then
Hmm.
they negotiated down. So here's a small little group. Like, if they got hit with
Yeah.
750 grand, like that could have been, game changing for them,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So we have, not only to deal with criminals, but we have to comply with federal and state regulations too, which I
Okay.
think a
So
lot of doctors don't think about.
right. So because they're probably assuming they pay the ransom, they're done, but potentially they're looking at an investigation as well.
They absolutely will have an
Okay.
investigation. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
when you have a ransomware attack
Hmm.
under federal law, a ransomware attack is a breach,
Okay.
right? Now, if you can prove that they didn't access your patient records or
Hmm.
steal your records, you
Hmm.
may not have a reportable event. But if your records were compromised, you have to notify the federal government, OCR, Office for Civil Rights,
Yeah.
and they will post your name to a public website, letting everyone that looks at that website know you've been breached.
Yeah. Okay.
And look, the class action attorneys look at those sites, and then the next thing you
Ah.
know, if you were a patient of Smile Ortho of Orlando, Florida, right,
Right.
you could be part of a class action lawsuit. Contact the lawyers at this number, and then they
Hmm.
start finding all these patients that want to join the class action. It's really,
Yikes.
really unfortunate, because
Yeah.
now you're punishing the victims, and that's just not right.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay. Well, before we wrap up, so we've talked a lot about ransomware. What are you mentioned earlier? There's some other things that are out there that are a threat. Can you talk a little
Yep.
bit about what you see as maybe the top three under
Okay,
ransomware?
top three. Great question. Email intrusion.
Okay.
Email intrusion is greater than ransomware in terms of the number of cases that we do.
Okay.
This is where an employee's email account is compromised, or a doctor's email account is compromised.
Hmm.
It can be the result of clicking on a link, and it is often the result of credential harvesting, where they get an email, looks like it's from Google or
Hmm.
Microsoft. You got to reset your password, and the doctor just punches his or her username in and gives the hackers their access,
Ah, okay.
information. Now, here's what I say to every doctor. I'm sure we've all written an email that we don't want exposed, right? Oh, this patient was the biggest pain in the A.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even want them. How did you refer them to me? Or how could you, right? And we say stupid
Yeah.
things. We all
Yeah.
do it as humans. And
Yeah.
now hackers have access to all this email. And all of a sudden you're like, uh-oh, we got a problem here. Not
Mm,
only do I have a compliance issue, I got a huge reputational issue if this
right.
email gets published. What I tell every doctor is don't ever send an email that you don't want published on the front of the New York Times. It's
Ah,
that simple, right?
okay.
And the other challenge is especially doctors who have been in practice for a long time and are specialists, the sheer volume of emails regarding patients from the referrals is unbelievable,
Yeah.
right? So
Hmm.
we did an email breach for an oral surgeon, and over a 15-year period, there were over 100,000 emails related to patient care.
Oh, wow.
And the hackers got them all. And he's got a
Oh,
major problem right now. And I said to one of my colleagues, I'm like, you know what? It would have been better off that he had a ransomware attack in this case because, and he admitted, he said
hmm,
things about his employees that, to a consultant, that was trying to
right.
help with employees. Like,
Right.
it's not a good situation. So I think everyone gets that. The
Okay.
way you protect that is you have to turn on multi-factor authentication, right?
Okay.
Never ever use email without MFA turned on.
Okay.
B, always separate your personal emails from your work emails. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors have had that AOL account or that Gmail account for 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And they have family emails coming in, they have friends sending them stuff, and then they have communications with patients and doctors.
Okay.
That all gets out. That's a bad situation.
Okay.
So email intrusion, really, really important. Also to defend against, there's the email security. We already talked about that.
Yeah.
So I think that. And then the
Yeah.
other thing people have to understand is when you sign up for like Microsoft 360 email
Yeah.
and your IT company turns that on, like, hey, Dr. Mary, you've got email now.
Yeah.
You know what? There's hundreds of security controls in the Microsoft environment that have to be configured properly. And a lot of times the IT companies don't know that. And they just turn this stuff on. And then a year, 2 years later, there was a breach and it was 100% preventable. So, we gotta, right? This is the problem with any of this technology.
Right.
Everyone thinks it's like take it out of the box and use it.
Yeah.
And it's cheap. Like that just doesn't work.
Right.
It's like, yeah, I just bought $100,000 car. And someone gets in the car, slams the gas, and they spin out and crash. Like, oh, you know how to drive a car. Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Exactly.
The next thing is payroll fraud. This is another biggie. So the way this attack works is the threat actor will do research on your practice. They'll go to your website, they'll look at the names of the doctors, they'll find the name of the practice administrator, and then they'll make some assumptions. Like most practices use like ADP or Paychex or QuickBooks,
Right. Mm-hmm.
and then they'll find the name of a doctor or an employee. They'll send that practice administrator or doctor an email saying, hey, I just wanted to let you know. Let me backtrack. They assume the role of an employee, right? They'll create an email address that says Mary Stein, which is front
Yeah.
desk person.
Yeah.
They'll send the doctor or the administrator an email, and the email says Mary Stein. It says, hey, I want to let you know, doctor, I've changed my bank account information, and here's my new direct deposit info. And they'll actually fill out the ADP form, right? Scan it in and send it. And then the person who's in charge of payroll will go into ADP or Paychex or QuickBooks, make the changes for direct deposit, run payroll, and then that employee comes in and be like, doctor, I didn't get paid on Friday. What's going on? The doctor's like, no, I ran payroll. Here's the verification. And I got your email and I even changed your ACH. Maybe you gave me the wrong info. She's like, what are you talking about? I haven't changed my bank account. I never sent that email. And some employees will go, a month before they look at their bank statements, and that money's, you're not getting that back.
Right.
And so that's a big issue. That's one of the most easy things to defend against.
Mm-hmm.
You go to that employee and be like, hey, I got this email. That's it.
Yeah.
Did you send it or didn't you? And is this right?
Right.
You have to have a human conversation. I mean, I know everyone wants to do it electronically, but have a conversation.
Yeah.
The last one is wire fraud. I wouldn't say that this is as prevalent as ransomware and emails, but the dollars can be massive. So we had a case where an oral surgeon sold their practice to a DSO.
Mm-hmm.
And right before the wire was sent by the DSO to the oral surgeon, the DSO received an email that purported to be from the surgeon saying, "Hey, I just spoke to my accountant and he wants me to set up a new bank account just for this transaction." So the DSO, instead of calling the doctor and be like, "Hey, did you send this email?" They wire $2 million. And look, I don't quite understand the story here, but the doctor like expected the money on Monday, and by Friday she's like, "Oh, I never got it." And at that point, it was too late. The money was gone to a foreign country. Couldn't recoup it. Now you have the law firm involved. You have the seller. You have the buyer. Who's at fault? Where did the
Yeah.
email? Whose email got hacked? And the hackers
Mm-hmm.
were following this transaction. Believe it or not, this is more common than people realize. So it's so simple. Whether
Uh-huh.
you're selling real estate, right? Buying real, oh, not really selling, buying real estate.
Yeah.
Paying large bills, call the person that sent you that wiring information and be like, "Hey, I'm going to the bank now, or I'm going online. Tell me
Right.
the ABA, which is the routing number, and confirm the account number over the phone, person to
Mm-hmm.
person." And
Mm-hmm.
then you can do this, which is interesting for larger transactions. Send $1. Send one
Oh, to
dollar.
test it. Yeah.
Yeah, test transaction. I'm
Right.
going to send you $1. When
Mm-hmm.
you verify that's in your bank account, call me back and let's talk. And then
Yeah.
while we're on the phone, I'll send the remaining 500,000.
Right.
So little things like this make a
Yeah.
huge difference, because a lot of the cyber coverage doesn't offer high limits on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's very often that it'll max at 250, and we've seen
Okay.
ortho practices lose a lot of money. They went to go buy a building and they lost all their money because someone intercepted email communications and changed the wiring information. And you're not
Okay.
getting it back
Okay.
unless you can get a hold of the FBI within 24 hours. Then you could get it back.
Okay.
But
Okay.
anyway,
Okay. And so that stuff, it's somebody's been sitting in your email
right,
or has for a while, probably
for
at
sure.
that point. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Someone's watching the transaction, watching your email,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Or it could be on the receiver's end. You're working with a real estate
Right.
agent, for instance,
Yeah.
an attorney for the closing,
Mm-hmm.
sale of a practice, purchase of a building, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And
Yeah.
they'll strike just at the right time, right? It could
Right.
be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. They're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
great. We know everyone's going to be out. The attorneys aren't going to look at this. I'm going to send this. They're going to wire it. No one's not going to know until Monday or
Mm-hmm.
Tuesday." And
Mm-hmm.
Monday's going to come and they're just going to say, "Well, it was over the weekend. The banks don't do anything. So let's just give it until Tuesday."
Yeah.
And it's too late. It's gone.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the thing to keep in mind is these people are patient. They will wait
Oh, yeah.
and find a moment, whether it's the
They always
ransomware
have
or it's
time.
this.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right.
Yeah.
They always have time on their hands. So,
Okay. Okay. Well, Gary, it has been an absolute pleasure, although a little scary,
all good.
a little overwhelming, but we will talk to you again soon to maybe go a little bit further or answer some questions as we get them. But
you can do something. I think that's
yeah,
the
I think
statement.
so.
here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
And
the positive takeaway. And a lot of doctors don't know that this is out there, so they don't even know how to address it.
yeah.
They become a victim and then they find out how to fix, and prevent them. That's not
Well,
really good.
And I think what you said there, everything you kind of outlined during this conversation is as long as they have a plan
Yep.
and know the things they have to check off, whether it's daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly, to make sure they're following those best practices and their staff are following those best practices, then it is doable.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. Great.
You got it.
Thank you so much, Gary. If anybody wants to reach out to you at Black Talon, how should they do that?
Sure. blacktalonsecurity.com. Check us out there. You can go to, you can hit me on email, Gary@blacktalonsecurity.com. And then find me on LinkedIn. I have thousands of doctors that follow me on LinkedIn. We're constantly posting really good content there. Many things you can do yourself to protect yourself. And it's Cybersecurity Month right now, so we're posting lots of content. But whatever works for your listeners.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate it.
Later.
Take care. As always, thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Orthodontic Products Podcast to keep up with the latest episodes. And be sure to check out orthodonticproductsonline.com to keep up with the latest industry news. Until next time, take care.